Sometimes movies find you, and that is the case with today's Foreign Fridays True Crime Edition, the Australian movie Hounds of Love. I came across this movie years ago. I don't know how I came across it, why I came across it, but I recently rewatched it and it's just as terrifying as I remember. And so this movie is currently streaming on Mubi Canada, and briefly set in the suburbs of Perth in the mid-1980s. We follow 17-year-old Vicki as she's abducted from a neighborhood by serial killers John and Evelyn White. As she observes the dynamic between her captors, Vicki quickly realizes that she must drive a wedge between the couple in order to survive. So the story is quote-unquote loosely based on actual serial killers David John and Catherine Margaret, who murdered 4 women at their home in 1986 and attempted to murder a 5th woman. The crimes were referred in the press as the Morehouse murders after their address, 3 Morehouse Street in a suburb in Perth. And Vicki eerily resembles the only surviving victim of these serial killers. So at the time, this case was actually dangerously close to being totally ignored by the police. So on November 10th, 1986, a 17-year-old girl arrived at a small suburban police station in Perth with a story of kidnapping and assault. Skeptical officers kind of passed her down to a more inexperienced staff member who just so happened to also be the only female on duty. This young constable never actually took a statement before, but as she was listening to this young girl speak, she realized that the story was just being told in a way that was difficult to ignore. The teenager described getting a lift from this couple while walking home, and once in the car, she claims that this couple held a knife to her throat, and then she was imprisoned and chained in the couple's home on Morehouse Street. The only reason she was able to get away is through a window. And even that was very difficult because she kind of had to face off with this vicious dog. And she described a lot of details about the house. For example, she described watching the movie Rocky with this couple. She described the music and the cassette tapes. She described having been forced to take sleeping pills, but she kind of hid the pills underneath the bed. And the most important description is that although this couple was using pseudonyms around her, she was able to identify their real names, one in particular, which is David Burney. And this information was impossible to ignore and forced investigators to look into her case. So after hours and hours of interrogation, David led police to a series of graves at Glendale National Park, and they found the bodies of 4 women they had abducted, tortured, and killed over a 5-week period of time. So each of them was sentenced to life in prison. David eventually committed suicide, but Catherine, as I understand, is still incarcerated. Filmmakers of Hounds of Love strongly resist the suggestion that this is based on a true story. Writer-director Ben Young said that he drew on accounts of 9 different serial killer couples, and the purpose of the movie was to explore the psychological dependence that leads females to assist their partners. So the whole point of the movie was to figure out more of the psychology on the female side as to why she would go along with such a thing. Although they claim that it was based on all these different cases, there's a lot of similarities that were very hard to ignore. The layout of the house in the film closely resembles the layout of Catherine and John's house. And the sole survivor of the crime, this young 17-year-old girl, is actually now a mother of 3. And she is a bit annoyed that the film drew on her story, and she wishes they had used their own imagination. She says that I feel taken advantage of and confused, and it's disappointing because she wants these people to be forgotten. At the time, Hounds of Love was just one of many Australian films that drew on gruesome true crime murders, and obviously this is not without controversy. In an interview, basically Ben explained this is his first movie, and it's a very impressive directorial debut. And he describes growing up in Perth in the 80s, and he says that there was this feeling that you could pretty much get away with anything because of the landscape. So there was a lot of kidnappings, there was a lot of people going missing, and for some reason the police just had a very, very difficult time finding what happened to these people. He was a bit traumatized because it just didn't really make sense to him as a kid. And again, like the landscape of Australia, like there's just a lot of space. And so it's very difficult. Like once you go missing, there's only so much they can do, right? So there was this feeling that you could kind of get away with anything, and it seemed like a lot of people were. So Hounds of Love came out in 2016. And of course, since then, there have been an influx of true crime, not just movies, but documentaries. And what's worse is that at least Hounds of Love doesn't refer to the serial killers or the victims by name, right? Like now the documentaries and the movies that are coming out are far more explicit. They're using their names, they're using the victims' names. Like it's clearly based on a true crime event. And of course, questions continue about the ethics of dramatizing or taking inspiration from real killings for entertainment purposes, especially when victims of these families or the victims themselves are still alive. This controversy was of course seen in the Netflix series Dahmer. But nevertheless, Hounds of Love, I think it does two things very well. First, it's a very impressive debut, like for first-time directors or for first-time artists. It's worth a watch. You know, the things he was able to do just by, you know, using a simple set and having very, very great actors. I think that's what helps this movie a lot. So the budget was extremely low, of course. And so the way they were able to get around it is that they shot in these neighborhoods that looked very similar to how they did in the 80s, because a lot of the suburbs in Perth obviously underwent a lot of construction and they modernized, but thankfully there were still little pockets of neighborhoods left that looked very much like they did in the 80s. The most unbelievable thing about this movie, besides the direction, is actually the music and the score. Like, it adds to the tension. Like, you feel like you're kind of stuck in that house with Vicki, and the acting with the score is like, it kind of elevates it to a different level. The costumes were super easy to afford, right? Like, a lot of the stuff they're wearing, like, they could just kind of get at thrift shops or anywhere. And so the aesthetic, you know, it fits the time period really well. You do feel like you're watching a movie set in that time period. And most importantly, the cast is great. And I found out that the actor who plays John is actually like a very well-known comedian in Australia. So that kind of tripped me out because you wouldn't know it watching this. Evelyn, the actress who plays Evelyn, she was able to, like, a lot of the movie hinges on her performance. And because of that, I think the movie worked very well. And the violence. So Ben does a good job of knowing when to turn away. Like, this easily could have turned into torture porn, but somehow it just doesn't. Not seeing the horror actually makes it all the more horrifying. And he does this very smart thing where he incorporates like slow motion shots just before something horrible is about to happen. And so these slow motion shots give you enough time to get your imagination going before the actual horror begins. So that was a very effective tool. You know, you don't have to see it to feel it. I think the reason this movie aged very well is because, to be honest, the people you need to worry most about sometimes are your neighbors, right? Are the people around you. You know, how is it that such darkness, such evil, such, you know, menace was hidden in plain sight? And that's very much true, right? That is not far from the truth at all. And I also really enjoyed that they were able to follow the victim while at the same time trying to unpack what it is that's driving Evelyn to be with John without excusing her behavior. And that is really much helped by the performances. So this is well worth a watch if you're interested in directing, or if you're just interested in true crime. Like, this is probably a movie you haven't seen before, and so I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. To start, the film opens up in a suburb of Perth in the mid-1980s, and one of the most terrifying things about this film is that it takes place in an otherwise ordinary neighborhood. These people are not living out in the middle of nowhere. They have neighbors, they have a community, they go to the shop, like, people know about them. And so I can't imagine all these horrors just hanging around, you know, just being right next door. Like, there's one thing if you're screaming in the woods or you're screaming in the forest. It's a whole other thing to be screaming next door and no one can hear you. That is absolutely terrifying. And so the movie begins with these very slow motion shots, and it takes you a while to even realize that things are moving, and all you see are bodies. And you realize that we are looking through the eyes of this murderous couple, and that automatically just makes this whole, like, it just sets this very uneasy, very creepy tone. And so before we even meet Vicki, we get a glimpse into how sick these people are. They, like, right at the start of the film, they managed to kidnap a girl and never to be seen again. And the only shot we get of this young girl that they ended up kidnapping is of her wrists after they tortured her and just before they dump her body out. So it seems like they have this ritual where they kidnap a girl, torture her for a few days, and then clean up after themselves. And John is the one tasked with killing and dumping the body. And again, you would expect to be killed in the woods, but not, in a suburb next door. It's not like they're locking them in a basement. It's not like there's this dungeon, right? Like, they keep their victims in a spare room. And so there's this kind of false hope about this whole movie where you're like, how is it? It's totally a matter of time before anybody figures them out, but clearly that's just not the case. So John and Evelyn are not really criminal masterminds. Like, these people are not geniuses, and it's helped by the time period that they're in. Like, people were a lot more trusting back then than they were now, and you wouldn't really think twice of a couple giving you a ride, especially in this type of community. Like, these type of crimes happen in the city. They don't happen in the suburbs, and that's another thing, right? They don't happen in these types of settings. And the reason they're so successful is because they're a couple. And without Evelyn, it's very unlikely that John would be able to lure all these young girls. He would probably have to target a different demographic of females, right? So, these young girls see two people, yeah, you're more likely to jump into the car. In addition, we find out that there's a lot of missing girls in this town. And the reason they haven't been properly investigated is because they just assume that they're runaways. And again, they're not criminal masterminds, but the idea of forcing them to write these letters to make it seem like they just ran away, it does enough to convince the police officers, because again, in their minds, these types of crimes don't happen in our neighborhood. So instead of focusing on the heinous nature of their crimes and kind of unpacking or showing us all these victims that they killed, the movie chooses to focus specifically on John and Evelyn's relationship. And I really enjoyed that because Vicki's life is literally mirrored by the instability of John and Vicki's relationship. Like, these sort of ups and downs give her some hope, right? That's what kind of keeps her alive. One minute you think she's dead, the next minute you're like, maybe she has some hope. And that's the thing about this film. Like, you're not sure if she's gonna survive or not, right? You think as the movie goes on, you just hope that these people get caught, or that a neighbor hears the screams, or maybe these shady people that they have, dealings with will come into the house and they'll notice something. And it's a bit terrifying because Vicki in particular is an interesting victim because her parents are separated and they're getting divorced. So it's not out of the blue. It doesn't seem that crazy that she would run away. And so the odds of the police really taking her seriously dwindle even more. And fortunately for Vicki, John develops this weird obsession with her, and that's the only reason that she's able to kind of keep herself alive. And so I'll start with the dynamic between John and Evelyn, and then move into how Vicki kind of is able to disrupt that. Starting with John, John is not someone, the thing about John's character is that he just gets increasingly unhinged. There's no hope on his part. You can see it in his eyes. You can see it in his vibe. This is a guy that's just straight crazy. And his physicality is interesting because he's a very small man. And when he's dealing with other men, he's not able to hold his ground. He's kind of a wimp. But when he's around females, he's able to control them, right? That's why he's targeting schoolgirls. Evelyn, he's been grooming since she's 13. And so that's why because you're watching the movie and you're like, how does this guy have such a hold over her? So I like that he was able to, despite his small stature, was able to convey his absolute like insanity, just like looking at his eyes. So Evelyn is not a sympathetic character. You're not supposed to side with her. But at the same time, you kind of understand why she's going along with John. So John has basically convinced Evelyn that these murders will somehow keep them together, right? It's actually bringing them closer, and it proves that he loves her. And so they both have different reasons for engaging with these crimes. John is just a sicko. This is just something that he needs to do. But Evelyn, you know, when you're kidnapping like beautiful young girls, for her, it proves that even more that he loves her. It's like we're doing all this together. So they do everything, the torture. The only thing they don't do together is the murder. Evelyn is very, very devoted to him. He still abuses her. He still hits her. He pretty much tells her whatever she needs to hear in order for him to get her to do whatever he wants. And no matter how hard she tries, like, he's never really satisfied. And Evelyn just has this desire to build a family. And she feels like if she does everything John tells her, that this will somehow prove that she's worthy. That's what he hangs over her head. So Evelyn has 2 children. She doesn't see these two children, and rightfully so. The reason they probably took these children out probably had something to do with this man. And it doesn't seem like she's allowed to see her children. It doesn't seem like, you know, she has a relationship with the father. Like, whatever happened, it was bad enough that she's out. And Evelyn, like, her performance is really nice because you can see the rage build up inside her. Like, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And because that's the thing about their relationship. Like, it's not like a volatile relationship. It's one-sided. Like, John is very volatile to Evelyn, but Evelyn she never fights back, right? She never fights back. But she does have this anger inside her. Whether she's trying to talk to her children, whether she's out on the street, you know, she has all this rage, but she's careful not to take it out on John. And so by the end of the movie, it's not that surprising that she stabbed him multiple times, because a lot of her anger and a lot of the reason that she's in the situation that she's in is because of this man. And that gets increasingly hard to ignore as the movie goes on. So that explains a little bit about John and Evelyn, and then Vicki comes into it. So Vicki's presence in their relationship pretty much destabilizes them. And the reason for that is John just develops an unhealthy relationship with this young girl. Vicki has the misfortune of coming across John and Evelyn when she sneaks out of her mother's house to attend a party. And watching Vicki walk in the dark, like, it was a bit terrifying because, again, the landscape itself is a bit ominous, because you get the sense that even if she didn't go into this couple's car, like, something bad was going to happen to her. Like, people are driving past her drunk, people are doing all kinds of things, and so she gets into the car. And they don't really have to do much to convince her to come inside. And a lot of the reason that Vicki kind of went against her better judgment is because of Evelyn, right? Like, she made her feel very comfortable, very safe. They're having this conversation outside of her home, and, you know, she's asking her about her children, about how long she's known the couple. And then Vicki is looking at them like they're normal people. Like, of course they have kids. Of course they've been together for a long time. And you could tell that Evelyn is triggered, but whatever the case, it's enough to lure her inside. And once Vicki is inside the house, they don't have to knock her out. They don't have to drag her into some basement. They don't have to pull a knife to her throat. Like, there's nothing off about the house, right? There's no reason for her not to come inside and take a seat. And it's really scary to think, because you could be in someone's house and not know how crazy they are, right? Like, I imagine all the people that have been in this house and they probably didn't think anything of it. Like, it's spotless. And so she had no reason not to take the drink. And so as she's looking around, she starts to notice small details, specifically these VHS tapes, these kind of like pornographic teen tapes. And unfortunately, by the time she notices there's something off, it's too late, right? She's knocked out. It's over, and she is locked into that house. Once they're sure that Vicki is trapped, the real Evelyn and the real John come out, and this is when her hell begins. And the movie does a good job of putting us in her shoes, because it's like, what would you do if you were in Vicki's position? Because these are not criminal masterminds. Like, there is that sense where you could fight back, and you could tell that Vicki was thinking that while she was chained up. So it's like, do you fight back? Do you just go along with everything they say? Like, it does feel like a real life situation, because I don't know what I would do. because the psychology of it is so terrifying. And Vicki keeps trying to tell herself, like, oh, maybe it's a ransom, or maybe, like, you know, eventually they'll let me out. Like, who would have thought that they were gonna do all that? So the longer she's around this couple, she knows instinctively, like, these people are nuts, right? She notices the stack of letters and all these small details that are alerting her that these people are crazy. It doesn't matter how obedient she is. It doesn't matter if she does everything she's told, like, they're gonna kill her. And this whole thing about writing letters, again, like, Evelyn is so unhinged. And again, the movie doesn't excuse her behavior, but you do understand it. She's a mother. She hasn't seen her children. When she's forcing Vicki to write this letter, she keeps telling her, like, tell your mother that you love her. Tell her that you want to see her. Like, tell her that everything will be okay. Because Evelyn's children don't see her. They don't tell her that they love her. And so she really resents John for that. And some part of her sympathizes with Vicki's mother, if not Vicki, right? As far as she's concerned, these girls are spoiled and they're not really people in her eyes. And the only reason she develops some type of sympathy towards Vicki is because she finds out that her parents are separated. So the whole time that Vicki is in their house, it's a bit terrifying because, like, they don't torture her right away. So there is this kind of weird false sense. Again, they're not keeping her trapped in a basement. Like, it does really feel like she could just get out at any time. Like, it doesn't seem far-fetched. And so they're kind of preparing her, you know, and that just adds to the tension because you're kind of like, I hope that she can escape before something terrible happens. And Vicki, thank God, is intelligent enough to, like, kind of plant seeds. You know, the whole idea of writing in an address or putting in clues in the letter that hopefully her mother will figure out. Like, Evelyn and John are not geniuses. They're just hoping that they can scare this girl enough for long enough that she'll do whatever they want her to do until they're done with her, and then they'll dump her body. And so the whole time Vicki is there, she immediately clocks that there's something wrong with this couple, like they're unstable, that, you know, that Evelyn is the weak one. And the only reason that Evelyn kind of relents is because of John's obsession with her. Like, he wants to be alone with her. He lies about being alone with her. She catches him a few times and he just lies. He's a pathological liar. And one of the most terrifying scenes is when Evelyn goes up to John and she's like, if you love me, you'll kill her. You know, I don't want her here for too long. And what I understood from that is, again, she doesn't have much sympathy for the victim. She's more just disturbed by the fact that this man that she's given up her own family for doesn't love her and is just using her to torture these girls. And that whole scene when they went in together, they tag teamed her together, and the slow motion shots, like, it took so long for these guys to walk into the room and you're not seeing anything. You just see a box. You see her screaming, but you don't hear it. And so this whole sequence, the slow motion, like, it's enough time for your mind to get racing that you don't actually have to see anything. You feel like you saw everything even before the door closed. And that's where the horror in this movie is like the suggestions, right? Like, you really don't have to see it to believe it. The longer that Vicki is in this house, the less hope you have that she will survive. And as I said earlier, like, her only hope of survival is how unstable the relationship between John and Evelyn is, right? Like, one minute they tag team her together, the next minute John is killing Evelyn's dog. And the whole thing about killing the dog, again, the dog is just a tool to be used. Like, John's character is a psychopath. Like, he stays the same. He just gets more unhinged. And Evelyn's breaking point came when he killed the dog. And I thought it was so interesting that how he killed the dog not long after they just had this torture session together, you know, with Vicki. And I was really sure that Vicki was dead after that, right? Because the closer this couple is, the more on the same page they are, the more doomed Vicki is. Like, it takes one incident for her to get any hope, and you could see it, like, kind of racing through her brain. And the thing is with Vicki, like, you don't see the torture, but you see, like, the toll that it has on her. And she has nothing else to lose. Like, she's tired. She knows that these people are going to kill her. Like, this is not a ransom. And so she kind of just becomes, like, she's so over it. Only reason that Evelyn begins to turn on John is because of this dog situation. So as quickly as they were bonded, they were quickly torn apart, right? Like he loses his mind and he kills the dog. And the fact that he killed the dog kind of suggests that he's getting worse, right? His temper, his anger, his frustration, especially considering that they owe people money, like things are getting worse. And that's not something that she really would have expected from him. And then this situation is made worse by the fact that Vicki's mother comes to the neighborhood to try and find her. So there's this whole plot off screen about Vicki's mother and her father and her boyfriend all trying to figure out where Vicki really is. And the police don't really care because as far as they're concerned, her parents are divorced. It's not far-fetched that she would run away. And watching her mother like scream in that neighborhood trying to find her daughter, it's really telling because that last victim, I was reading reports that when she did escape, she knocked on multiple doors, but nobody would help or open up. And it's not until she made it to a convenience store that they called the police. And even then, the police will not help. So it's really interesting. This woman is screaming for her daughter and no one thinks to help her. No one thinks to approach her. No, again, you would think that people would be concerned. People would be like, what's wrong in this suburban neighborhood? But nobody cares. And you see John just looking outside, like smiling. He has no emotions. He's just a sicko, right? Like it doesn't move him at all, but it does move Evelyn. So the mistake that John made is that he told Evelyn to kill Vicki, but she's not a killer. And the movie made that clear from the very beginning. And the more she hears her mother, like Vicki's mom, like screaming for her, the worse she feels. Like she's so conflicted, she's shaking. She's starting to realize that this is not who she wants to be. Whereas John is just chill. Again, his character just gets increasingly unhinged. And Evelyn is a very interesting character because she's kind of become this monster and she's aware that she's become this monster and she's not too proud of herself. Again, that doesn't excuse her behavior, but you do get the sense that this is someone who's not proud of themselves. And the fact that she was unable to kill Vicki, it kind of indicates that. And the only reason that John finally wanted to end Evelyn's life is because he realized they were like one door down from being caught. And again, these guys are not criminal masterminds. They didn't really clock how this letter writing thing would come back to bite them in the butt. And so he's strangling her and he's trying to kill her. And when Evelyn does end up killing John, it's really not surprising because she has all this frustration and this anger. And a lot of it is caused by John. And she's done a good job of diverting it. But it's hard to ignore anymore. So she stabs him multiple times. And I wasn't surprised that she stabbed him. And I also wasn't surprised that she let Vicki go because I think she was tired. I think she was just tired. And she'd kind of come to the realization that all the things she was doing, just put her in the situation that she's in. And so the movie ends with mother and daughter reunited. And watching this girl just bloodied up and tortured in this normal neighborhood, again, it's very eerie because you don't really know what people are doing. And you can't really assume you're safe anywhere. This is an otherwise normal neighborhood. Things like this don't happen. And so, it was just such a stark contrast, right? Like all these normal people. And then you see this girl that's just bloodied up and just has been through the ringer. Like just done. And so that's how the movie ends. And I think it's very much worth a watch. First, if you're if you're interested in directing or you're interested in writing, like what you can do with a good cast and just a very simple setup. Second, I thought it was very respectful in terms of like true crime. It was interesting to see Evelyn's character. Like you don't sympathize with her, but you do begin to understand her. And the nature of the crimes are so heinous that you do have to wonder what kind of person would do this. And so the first type of person is someone like John who's just sick. And the second type might be someone who might not be a monster by default, but has some type of monster inside them, if that makes sense. And so Evelyn's performance was fantastic because you get it. You're like, I understand what got you to this point. It doesn't excuse your behavior, but I get it. So overall, it's well worth a watch. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.